Before he was a titan of the international stage, D.L. Moody was a fifth-grade dropout with a stutter and a desperate need to escape the crushing poverty of a debt-ridden farm. He began his journey not with a Bible in his hand, but with a trunk full of shoes and an insatiable hunger for $100,000. Yet he ended it having moved 2 continents for a cause he initially didn't even understand. The landscape of 19th century Christendom was forever altered by a man who possessed neither a formal theological education nor the social polish of his contemporaries. Dwight Lyman Moody emerged from the rugged soil of New England, not as a product of academic institutions, but as a force of nature, driven by a relentless internal engine of faith and commerce. His life serves as a profound study in the synthesis of American industrial ambition and evangelical fervor. Moody did not merely preach the gospel, he revolutionized its delivery, applying the same entrepreneurial grit to the salvation of souls that he once applied to the sale of footwear. His impact was global, bridging the gap between the burgeoning urban centers of America and the established ecclesiastical traditions of the British Isles. To understand Moody is to examine the evolution of the self-made man through a spiritual lens. He operated within a century of rapid transition, witnessing the horrors of the Civil War and the literal ash of the Great Chicago Fire. Yet he remained fixed on a singular objective, the immediate and total conversion of the individual. This narrative explores the genesis of his mission, tracing the arc of a life that moved from the obscurity of a debt-ridden farm to the pulpits of the world's greatest cities, forever defining the methods of modern mass evangelism. The foundational years of Dwight Moody's life were characterized by a visceral struggle for survival that effectively purged any room for sentimentality or leisure. Born on February 5, 1837, in Northfield, Massachusetts, his arrival into the world was framed by the modest circumstances of a farmer and tradesman's household. However, the relative stability of his early childhood was shattered when he was only 4 years old. The sudden death of his father, Edwin Moody, on May 28, 1841, due to heart complications, plunged the family into a state of acute vulnerability. The departure of the patriarch left Betsy Moody with the monumental task of providing for 9 children on a scrubby subsistence farm. The reality of their poverty was not merely a lack of luxury, it was a daily negotiation with hunger and debt. Edwin Moody had been a man of good nature and affection, yet his struggle with alcohol had left the family's financial foundations precarious even before his passing. In this environment, Dwight was forced into the workforce prematurely. By the time most children were settling into the rhythms of grammar school, Dwight and his older brothers were being farmed out as hired hands to local neighbors for several months each year. This early displacement functioned as a harsh but effective training ground for self-reliance. The necessity of earning his keep among strangers stripped away the protections of childhood, replacing them with a keen understanding of labor and value. Education became a secondary concern, a luxury the family could ill afford. Consequently, Dwight's formal schooling ended after the 5th grade. He would later reflect on this period not with bitterness, but as a providential necessity, noting that the absence of a father and the subsequent throwing on to himself was the catalyst for his future resilience. By the age of 17, Moody possessed a vocabulary as limited as his social exposure, yet he harbored a restless ambition that the rocky soil of Northfield could not satisfy. With no more than 4 years of sporadic education, he found himself at a crossroads: remain a farm laborer or seek his fortune in the burgeoning urban economy. In 1854, he chose the latter, migrating to Boston. The transition from the rural stillness of Massachusetts to the chaotic energy of a coastal city was jarring, but it provided the arena Moody required to exercise his latent salesmanship. Employment arrived through his uncle, S.S. Holton, who operated a shoe shop. Here, the traits that would later define his ministry, boldness, persistence, and a refusal to accept no as an answer, first manifested. Dwight was not content to wait for customers behind a counter. Instead, he took to the streets, literally crying his wares before the door and persuading uninterested passersby to enter the shop. This aggressive, proactive approach to commerce was the secular precursor to his future evangelistic crusades. He found a distinct joy in the success of a sale, a thrill that hinted at a deeper capacity for persuasion that had yet to find its true object. While his uncle provided a livelihood, he also imposed a strict condition. Dwight was required to attend the Mount Vernon Congregational Church. This was a significant theological shift for the young man. His family's only prior religious connection was with a Unitarian congregation in Northfield, a relationship born out of the Unitarian pastor's practical charity toward the widowed Betsy Moody rather than doctrinal conviction. At Mount Vernon, Dwight was exposed for the first time to the rigorous, Christ-centered focus of Trinitarian Christianity. Despite the formal Sunday worship, it was not the sermons that pierced Moody's armor, but the persistent kindness of his Sunday school teacher, Edward Kimball. On Saturday, April 21st, 1855, Kimball felt a spiritual prompting to visit his pupil at the shoe shop. Finding Dwight alone in the back room wrapping shoes, Kimball bypassed the social niceties and spoke directly to the young man about his personal need for a savior. The mechanics of this conversion were strikingly simple. There was no lightning bolt or emotional ecstasy, but rather a quiet prayer of confession and repentance led by a teacher who cared for a soul. This moment in the back of a shoe store became the pivot point of Moody's life. It transformed his ambition from the accumulation of wealth to the stewardship of a message. The tenacity he had previously used to sell shoes was now wedded to a transformative encounter with Christ's love, setting the stage for his departure to Chicago and the birth of a global ministry. The relocation to Chicago in September 1856 marked the beginning of a meteoric rise in both Dwight Moody's secular and spiritual life. Chicago at the midpoint of the 19th century was a city of frenetic growth and unbridled capitalism, a perfect mirror for Moody's own relentless energy. He arrived with a single-minded focus to amass a fortune of $100,000. This goal was not born of mere greed, but of a desire to secure the financial independence that had been so cruelly denied to his mother. Moody's success in the Chicago shoe trade was instantaneous. He possessed an uncanny ability to read people and a drive that outpaced his competitors. He did not wait for customers. He haunted the train stations and hotels, intercepting travelers before they could reach other merchants. His letters home during this period reveal a man possessed by the thrill of the chase. In less than a year, he had saved $500, a substantial sum for the era, and his reputation as a business hustler was firmly established. However, this period of financial accumulation coincided with a deepening spiritual restlessness. The conversion in Boston had implanted a seed that the materialism of Chicago could not suffocate. He joined the Plymouth Congregational Church, but his brand of Christianity was never destined to be passive. Finding the pews filled with the comfortable middle class, Moody began to look toward the periphery. The slums, the dock workers, and the immigrant populations that the traditional church often overlooked. Moody's transition from salesman to soul winner began in the Sands, one of Chicago's most notorious and impoverished districts. Prevented from teaching due to his lack of formal education, he took a characteristically pragmatic approach. He rented his own pews and filled them with the unwashed and unreached. When that was not enough, he founded his own Sunday school in a former saloon. The way he built this ministry was through radical engagement. He used candy, pony rides, and sheer charisma to lure street children into his school. He understood that to reach the heart, one must first meet the immediate social and emotional needs of the individual. By 1860, the North Market Hall Sunday School had grown to over 1,000 members, making it one of the largest in the country. This success forced a definitive choice. In 1860, Moody abandoned his lucrative business career entirely. He famously declared, "I have decided to give all my time to the service of God," transitioning into a life of faith-based living where he refused a fixed salary, trusting instead in the voluntary support of those who moved in his circles. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 redirected Moody's focus toward the spiritual needs of the soldiers. Though his pacifist leanings kept him from bearing arms, his sense of urgency found an outlet through the United States Christian Commission. He spent extensive time at Camp Douglas in Chicago and traveled to the front lines, following major battles, including Shiloh and Murfreesboro. His experiences on the battlefield stripped away any remaining theological abstractions. Faced with dying men, Moody learned to deliver a compressed gospel, one that was immediate, personal, and stripped of ecclesiastical jargon. He realized that in the shadow of death, there was no time for complex liturgy. There was only time for the fundamental purpose of the cross and the exact process of salvation. This period solidified his belief that the gospel was a rescue mission, a conviction that would define his later mass crusades. The year 1871 served as a spiritual and physical watershed for Moody. Two events converged to fundamentally alter his trajectory. The first was a profound internal experience. During a trip to New York, Moody described a baptism of the Holy Spirit so overwhelming that he had to ask God to stay his hand. This experience shifted his ministry from a reliance on human push and organizational genius to a dependence on spiritual power. He ceased trying to work for God and began allowing God to work through him. The second event was the Great Chicago Fire in October 1871. In a single night, his home, his church, the Illinois Street Church, and his beloved YMCA building were reduced to ash. While a catastrophic loss, the fire functioned as a liberation. It severed his remaining ties to the material world and the edifice of ministry. He stood amidst the ruins of the city and realized that while buildings are temporal, the souls of men are eternal. With nothing left to lose and a newly ignited spiritual fervor, Moody turned his gaze toward the international stage. Moody's departure for the British Isles in 1873 was not a calculated move by a famous man. Rather, he arrived as a relatively unknown American layman. Accompanying him was Ira D. Sankey, a talented singer whose melodic gospel hymns would become the indispensable other half of Moody's message. Together, they would pioneer a model of evangelism that combined a simple, heartfelt message with professional, organized advance work. The success of the British campaigns, 1873 to 1875, was staggering. In cities like Edinburgh, Glasgow, and London, thousands flocked to hear the man who spoke like a businessman rather than a cleric. The essence of his appeal lay in his accessibility. Moody spoke the language of the common man, utilizing anecdotes in plain English to demystify the divine. He removed the stained glass barrier between the pulpit and the pew. Sankey's role was equally revolutionary. He introduced the solo as a means of preparation, using music not as a liturgical ornament, but as a tool to soften the heart and focus the mind on the theme of the evening. This Moody and Sankey partnership created a prototype for every major evangelistic movement of the 20th century. They were the first to utilize mass media, newspapers, and songbooks to sustain the momentum of their meetings, effectively branding the revival for a modern audience. Upon his return to the United States in 1875, Moody was no longer the humble shoe salesman from Chicago, but a recognized architect of modern faith. The American Crusades in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago were masterpieces of logistical precision. Moody recognized that the primary barrier to reaching the urban masses was the physical and social limitations of traditional church buildings. Consequently, he utilized massive secular venues, tabernacles, hippodromes, and converted depots to create a neutral ground where the working class felt welcome. The mechanism for these successes was a sophisticated system of committees. Before Moody arrived in a city, a network of local business leaders and clergy had already secured funding, trained ushers, and coordinated transportation. This business-like approach to the divine was not a dilution of the message, but a strategic removal of obstacles. He insisted on the cooperation of diverse denominations, focusing on the shared essentials of the Christian faith, rather than the theological minutiae that often divided congregations. By doing so, he created a unified front that made the gospel seem like a public necessity, rather than a private sectarian interest. As the 1870s transitioned into the 1880s, Moody's focus shifted from the immediate harvest of the crusade to the long-term cultivation of leaders. He understood that the momentum of a revival would inevitably wane unless it was anchored by permanent institutions. This realization led to the establishment of the Northfield Seminary for Young Ladies, 1879, and the Mount Hermon School for Boys, 1881, in his Massachusetts hometown. The underlying motivation for these schools was a desire to provide the education he himself had missed, but with a specific vocational bent toward Christian service. He aimed to equip young people from modest backgrounds with both academic rigor and spiritual discipline. This institutional legacy expanded significantly in 1886 with the founding of the Chicago Evangelization Society, later renamed the Moody Bible Institute. The institute was designed to be a West Point for Christian workers, a training ground for laypeople to engage in urban mission work. It reflected Moody's lifelong conviction that the most effective way to reach the city was through an army of trained, dedicated individuals who could move through the slums and marketplaces with the same ease he once had. By the early 1890s, Moody had become a global statesman. His influence extended into the academic world through the Northfield Conferences, which attracted the brightest theological minds and students from across the globe. It was during these gatherings that the student volunteer movement was born, a crusade that sent thousands of young people to foreign mission fields with the motto, "The evangelization of the world in this generation." Even as his health began to decline, Moody's pace did not slacken. He continued to manage his vast network of schools, publishing houses, and evangelistic tours with the same administrative acumen he had owned in the Chicago shoe trade. His life during this period was a testament to the idea that a single individual, when aligned with a clear sense of purpose and a mastery of organizational methods, could exert a disproportionate influence on the moral landscape of a nation. As the 19th century drew to a close, Dwight Moody's physical frame began to buckle under the weight of decades of unrelenting exertion. Yet, his final years were not a period of quiet retreat, but a strategic consolidation of his life's work. The way he approached his waning strength was characteristic of his entire career. He viewed his failing health not as a reason to stop, but as a deadline to be met with even greater intensity. A definitive moment of his late career occurred during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. While many religious leaders decried the secularism and sin of the fair, Moody saw an unprecedented opportunity. He organized a 6-month evangelistic campaign that ran concurrently with the exposition. Instead of competing with the fair's attractions, he utilized the city's theaters, music halls, and even circus tents to reach the millions of visitors. The success of this campaign illustrated the core of his methodology. He recognized that the church had to go where the people were, rather than waiting for the people to come to the church. By the end of the fair, millions had heard the gospel in non-traditional settings. This was the ultimate expression of his business of soul winning, capitalizing on a massive gathering of people to distribute his message with maximum efficiency. Throughout his final decade, Moody's approach to wealth remained as radical as his approach to preaching. Despite the vast sums of money that passed through his hands for his schools and missions, he maintained a personal lifestyle of relative simplicity. The basis of his financial management was rooted in a deep-seated integrity. He was often the subject of scrutiny, yet no scandal ever touched his accounts. He lived by the principle that money was a tool for the kingdom, not a trophy for the man. This lack of pretension extended to his theological stance. In an era of increasing denominational friction and the rise of modernism, Moody remained a bridge builder. He famously stated that he was too busy to have a creed, by which he meant that he refused to let theological debates hinder the practical work of evangelism. His focus remained on the fundamental root of the human condition, lostness, and the precise mechanics of the remedy, the grace of God. The end came in 1899 during a series of meetings in Kansas City. Despite warnings from his doctors and the clear signs of heart failure, he insisted on preaching. His final sermon was a characteristic appeal to the common man, delivered with the same urgency he had felt in the Chicago slums 40 years earlier. He was eventually forced to return to his home in Northfield, where he passed away on December 22, 1899. His final words, "Earth recedes, heaven opens before me," were not the sentiments of a mystic, but the report of a traveler who had reached his destination. He was buried on Round Top, a hill on his school's campus that had been the site of countless prayer meetings. His funeral was attended by thousands, ranging from simple laborers to the presidents of universities, all of whom recognized that a unique force in American history had departed. The legacy of Dwight L. Moody cannot be measured merely by the number of converts he claimed or the buildings that bear his name. His true impact lies in the evolution of modern Christianity. He was the pioneer of the urban mission, the father of the Bible Institute movement, and the architect of the professional evangelistic team. He proved that a lack of formal education was no barrier to intellectual and social influence when coupled with a clear vision and a relentless work ethic. Moody took the American spirit of enterprise and baptized it, creating a model for mass communication and social engagement that continues to influence the global church today. He remains a study in what occurs when a self-made man decides to let God do the making, transforming a poor farm boy from Massachusetts into the most effective communicator of his age. If you found value in this journey, from the back room of a shoe shop to the pulpits of the world, take a moment to reflect. What unlikely qualities in your own life might be the very tools needed for a greater purpose? Moody's life proves that lack of polish is no barrier to a world-changing impact when driven by conviction. To ensure you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible transformation, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to unpack the mechanics and the motivations behind history's most influential lives.